Greetings and welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales. Today we're going to discuss Native American gangs, primarily in the United States, but I will also briefly mention their activity in Canada. But before we get into the subject matter, let me give you a little personal history and why I feel I am qualified to speak on it, as well as a little background of the experiences of many Native Americans in this country. As many of you know, I was born in Yakima, Washington, and spent a lot of my summers on the Yakima Indian Reservation, which today is only a fraction of the original tribal lands. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, an area which has a deep history of individuals such as Chief South. The city was named after him, but since most whites could not pronounce his name correctly, they called it Seattle. I attended Chief South High School after his namesake, and many of my friends attended Indian Heritage High School in Seattle. I grew up in a diverse area in and around the High Point projects of West Seattle, and many times while growing up, I was mistaken for being Native. I am actually half Mexican and half white, but my great grandmother was 100% Yaqui Indian, so I guess you could say I was part Native. Many of my friends were Native, and I sometimes attended powwows and supported my Native brothers and sisters in causes such as fighting for fishing rights, and even joined the struggle at Frank's Landing, which is located between Tacoma and Olympia, Washington. After high school and a few run-ins with criminal elements in Washington State, I joined the United States Marine Corps. After that, I worked at Folsom Prison, where I noted many war stories in my autobio, including one about Native American gangs. After 6 years at Folsom, I worked at the King County Jail in Seattle for almost 25 years, where I often interviewed Native American offenders. European contact with Native Americans started in 1492 with Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer who completed 4 Spanish-sponsored voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, opening up the way for widespread European exploitation and colonization of the Americas. Columbus has been criticized for both his brutality and for initiating the depopulation of indigenous people in the Americas, whether by imported diseases or intentional violence by his forces. Subsequent colonizers added to the misery of native peoples. Nobody truly knows the size of the native population before Columbus, but many estimates range between 10 to 100 million. One thing for sure is disease killed many of them. Estimates of the population killed from 1492 to 1902 range from 5 to 50 million. Nobody knows for sure there either, but it is known that since the population had no immunity and medical science did little to treat victims, millions died. In the growing U.S., the theory of manifest destiny represented the belief in the 19th century U.S. that American settlers were destined to expand westward across North America. As they took over native lands, they forced many onto Indian reservations. There are many colorful characters during the mid-1800s to late 1800s, and depending on what side you sat on, they were considered criminals or heroes, depending on who was telling the story. Native Americans live in some of the most extreme cases of rural poverty in the world, and in recent years have encountered many of the same issues plaguing some of the country's largest cities. A prime example of this is the Badlands of South Dakota, which is home to the Pine Ridge Reservation and that of the Oglala Lakota Sioux. Pine Ridge was once home to Chief Crazy Horse, as well as the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, and it experienced poverty on levels usually only seen in third world nations. It is stated that over 90% of its residents live below the poverty line, and the unemployment rate is estimated to be 85 to 90%. Life expectancy is only 48 years for men and 52 years for women. Alcoholism and drug use is rampant, even though sales of alcohol are banned on the res. The Pine Ridge Reservation has also been faced with another growing problem in recent years, and that is that of gang violence. My buddy Chris Grant and I have talked together on several occasions across the U.S. Here we are pictured in Deadwood, South Dakota, which was considered part of the lawless Wild Wild West in the 1800s, with such figures as Wyatt Earp, Calamity Jane, and Wild Bill Hickok. Chris Grant is a former Rapid City police detective and captain, and I consider him to be the leading Native American gang expert in the United States.
I talk to kids as young as 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, starting there. because unfortunately some of these kids are coming from families where there's an addiction problem that's entrenched, that's deeply rooted within the family and has been for 2 or 3 generations.
Chris Grant is a former Rapid City police detective and leading Native American gang expert.
There's nothing within Native American culture that connects to being a gang member. Part of the reason some of these young people in Indian country move and embrace the gang subculture is because they're disconnected from their own traditional culture.
Some of the best-known Native-based gangs, Native Pride and Native Mob, are prevalent on Midwest reservations in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Native gangs in that area have also created their own versions of the Bloods, Crips, Serranos, Vice Lords, and Gangster Disciples. As gang activity continues to flourish and spread throughout the United States, so does the influence of gangs in many tribal communities. The origins of gangs in Indian country is usually traced back to the mid to late 1980s and early 90s during the crack cocaine epidemic, when such behaviors began emerging all over the United States, including tribal communities in the Southwest, Northwest, and Midwest. Gang activity in Indian country can usually be best described as being a hybrid form of gang behavior. In other words, the most common activity observed involves Native American youth and young people adopting the names and symbols of popular urban gangs, but they often do things that would be considered against the rules in places like Chicago and Los Angeles. Native gang structures also have formed with unique names, such as the Boys, Odd Squad, Red Nation Clique, etc. I remember doing a gang presentation with Chris in Washington State, where some of the tribal leaders felt that Native Pride was not a gang, and that many law enforcement were just stereotyping Native youth. It is true, Native Pride is more of a statement of pride in your culture, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there is, in fact, a gang called Native Pride in Washington State, and I documented many of those with NP tattoos, throwing up NP, tagging MP on the walls, and engaging in criminal activities. I told them that's the difference between having pride in your culture and being in a gang. Mr. Grant noted in one study that gang behavior in Indian country has a lot to do with relationships between individuals involved in opposing gang structures. In other words, often youth from one school or one area may fight against another area, or there may be different cliques within a certain school or area that feel that the other side has somehow disrespected them, and they seek a desire to extract revenge for any real or perceived insult. He noted that a number of subjects he interviewed revealed that despite the hatred and animosity gang members in tribal communities express for each other, there is also the attitude that if a gang from outside the tribal community poses a threat, they will often group together to confront this outside threat. Native Mob is a Native American street gang and are generally considered to be Bloods. They are one of the largest and most violent Native gangs in the U.S. and are active in such places as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Colorado, South Dakota, and Washington State. The gang was said to be created in the 1990s in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and by 2013, if not earlier, they had migrated to South Dakota to control drug turf and also established themselves inside prison. The gang has even been subject to RICO cases. Federal authorities at trial proved that the Native Mob is a regional criminal organization and that members routinely engaged in drug trafficking, assault, robbery, and other violent crimes, including murder. There are other gangs on the Pine Ridge Reservation, such as the Trey Crips, who were started by tribal members who encountered Crips in prison or while living off reservation. In Washington State, I encountered members of not only Native Pride, but Native Gangster Bloods, Native Gangster Crips, Native Disciples, and another thing that I noticed was often Native American youth ran with Sureños or Norteños, which is a California Mexican American gang phenomenon. There were local homegrown gangs like United Latinos that even had a subset called Native Gangster Tribe. Further to the north, our neighbors in Canada have also been faced with gang problems. Up there, the indigenous gangs are often called Aboriginal gangs. The Navajo Nation occupies portions of Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. On the Navajo Indian Reservation, there was a very violent gang called Redskin Kings, or RSK for short, and it was found that this criminal group was highly organized and extremely violent, and they were also hit with a RICO. which has often been used against groups like the Italian Mafia. One of the many concerns connected to the growth of the gangs in Indian country has to do with the connection of those gangs and drug cartel activity. I recall interviewing several Mexican drug cartel low-ranking members who told me that they like to have girlfriends or even wives who are natives because then they could get their green card and hide out on the res. And I know this sounds bad, but several of them told me that they would keep their old ladies drunk, and often they would be incarcerated in jail, and they would put a little money on their books, but take a lot of their monthly check. Basically, they were using them. These drug cartels also pay tribal members to tend crops of marijuana growing on the res, where, like I said, law enforcement presence is often thin.
The Blackfeet Reservation in northern Montana is beautiful and vast. It is also awash in fentanyl.
It's as if fentanyl is raining on our reservation. That I'll do anything to help.
Marvin Weatherwax Jr. is a tribal leader here and says much of the drug activity on his reservation stems from Mexican cartels selling to community members and using their homes, often in remote areas, as distribution hubs.
They've infiltrated our reservation. They've married in. They've basically set up shop. It's just a problem that won't go away.
Tell me what happens at night.
It's like a switch turns off and there's a whole different population takes over.
Federal law enforcement officials tell NBC News one of the most dangerous Mexican drug cartels, Sinaloa, once run by the notorious El Chapo, now in part by his sons, is targeting Blackfeet and the state's 6 other reservations with a steady flow of drugs, including fentanyl.
What brought you up here?
This is a rare glimpse into that trade. A Sinaloa cartel member pulled over by police on one of the reservations during one of his many trips up from Mexico.
Are you from around here? Or you got a passport?
Mexico. Mexico, yeah.
Ultimately, he and 2 other Sinaloa cartel members were convicted of bringing drugs and cash into Montana, resulting in one of the biggest drug busts in the state's history. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Over 700,000 fentanyl pills were seized in the case, according to Montana's U.S. Attorney Jesse Lasklevich, who was in charge of the federal prosecution. Why Montana?
Fundamentally, it's money. It's big business. These are transnational criminal organizations. They're sophisticated people who have a lot of resources and who are as dangerous as they come.
Many Native American inmates coming into the prison systems join gangs like the Native American Brotherhood, and many of the stronger, more aggressive inmates will be considered the elite and part of the Warrior Society. The Warrior Society is most active in Arizona Department of Corrections, although Warrior Society members can be found within various state institutions and jails across the country. I recall interviewing one Warrior Society member at the King County Jail in Seattle who told me that while he was in the feds, he would make runs for the Mexican Mafia. Many times, corrections will lock down groups by race, and since he was not Mexican, he was able to stay free in general population and do a lot of the Mexican Mafia's dirty work. Here are the Warrior Society bylaws. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Warrior Society was first identified in July of 1982. It reportedly had evolved from the Native American Brotherhood, but in 1989, the Warrior Society broke away for control of the NAB under the leadership of Eldon Daffy Escalante. Supposedly, rank is often indicated by feathers. Often these feathers will be on tattoos with such things as a claw or a circle. This is often referred to as being their patch. They have taken on native concepts, such as positions of a war chief. According to Chris Grant, there are 3 main factions today: Northern Warrior Society, Southern Warrior Society, and Diné Pride, which are all active in Navajo country. But there are other groups. For example, Minnesota has a Bear Paw Warrior Society that is not known to be connected to the Arizona faction. As stated earlier, Oklahoma and Texas has the Indian Brotherhood. North Dakota has Native Nation, South Dakota has Warlords, and Oregon and California have Indian Pride Organization. And I've also seen some of those individuals up in Washington State. Another consideration that should be discussed involves the fact that many Native Americans who are involved in gangs do not feel that their behavior will be addressed through the tribal community criminal justice system, as many times tribal elders are in denial or often will use the intervention model versus incarceration. I feel intervention is good, especially for first time, maybe second time offenders, but that there should be increased penalties for each violation. Otherwise, there's no reason to change. But there are some tribal law enforcement agencies that are aggressively addressing gang issues and dealing with them effectively and are not in denial. I've had several of these individuals in my gang classes, and many of the problems they're encountering are a little different from that faced in other communities. Again, many of these Native youth join gangs because they feel no attachment to their own cultures or feel disenfranchised from society. So a key to changing that mentality would be for them to learn to appreciate their own cultures, the deep, rich history of Native peoples, and to once again feel they are part of a community and contribute to it in a more positive manner. As my buddy Chris Grant states, the answer to dealing with the growing problem of gang activity in Indian country is often unclear. In many ways, gang activity can be characterized as being a symptom rather than a disease. While the behavior is problematic in and of itself, it is also connected to many underlying issues that contribute to its growth and manifestation. It is important to remember that the great majority of Native American youth and adults are not involved in gang behaviors. However, what is clear is that the gang problem in Indian country is very real and has already negatively impacted the lives of many young Native Americans and their families, and will continue to do so as long as the individuals involved choose this path of behavior. I hope you are on the right path or get on the right path in the near future. Let me end with a quote by Chief South. This we know, the earth does not belong to man, man belongs to earth. This we know, all things are connected, like the blood which unites one family. All things are connected. And with that, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.